Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third of the series, the Stimson Lecture series. Congratulations for getting through the snow and ice and dripping conditions. We might have one or two people slipping in late, of course, because of this weather, but thank you for coming and being on time, and thank you, especially if you've been to all three of these lectures by William Polk, a very distinguished servant of the country, foreign service commentator, foreign service practitioner, author of many works. We put a bio in the announcement of the lectures themselves. We're going to have the same format as with previous two lectures, ladies and gentlemen, a talk of about an hour and then time for Q&A. If I see it, a lot of hands up. We may keep it. We may go 5 or 10 minutes longer than we generally plan. But will you just join me in welcoming William Polk back to the podium?
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very complimentary, given the weather today, that any of you showed up. I'm so delighted to be back again. In my previous two talks, some of you will remember, I discussed the impact of colonialism and militarism on American society and what the Founding Fathers did to try to make American liberty more secure and the changes their successors made. Now in this final discussion, I turn to what has been tried to enhance the chances of our achieving what I call affordable world security, and what has diminished our chances of achieving it. You don't need me to recount the flow of violence in the world that pours over us every day from the media. Bombings, assassinations, renditions, torture, war have become the saga we live with. Instead, what I'm going to do today is to discuss and probe into how the world in which we live evolved at the end of the Second World War, how our government and its advisors tried to understand and cope with what they perceived to be the threats to our security. This is both a large and diffuse topic, and I will be able to deal with only a few aspects of it, and even with those, I'll have to skip much, so I'll try to be brief, but I warn you I probably will fail. I begin with two views, widely separated in time, on where we are today. Speaking at the University of Chicago in 1950, the grand strategist of the Cold War, George Kennan, said that the central puzzle that confronts Americans was the decline of American security. A half century ago, he said, people in this country had a sense of security vis-a-vis the world environment such as I suppose no people have ever had since the days of the Roman Empire. Today, that pattern is almost reversed. We have before us a situation which I'm frank to admit seems to me dangerous and problematical in the extreme. How did a country so secure become a country so insecure? That was 68 years ago. What has happened since? Have our policies, our efforts, our vast expenditure of talent and money resulted in the security we tried to achieve? One answer was given last September by the official who's essentially responsible for our major European foreign affairs area, the chief of NATO. The world, he said, is at its most dangerous point in a generation. You will have also seen that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has just moved us half a minute closer to midnight. In fact, our country has been secure, at least in the sense that we were not engaged in hostilities somewhere, for only about 20 years since the 1787 Constitutional Convention that I discussed the other day. And since the Vietnam War, we've been engaged in almost nonstop conflicts throughout most of the world. What the editors of the New York Times called America's forever wars now have us engaged in military operations in at least 172 countries and territories. More than 250,000 American servicemen and women, backed up by nearly that many mercenaries and special agents, have been carrying out the whole gambit of overt military and covert espionage activities. In my book, Crusade and Jihad, I dealt with some of the reasons behind the dangers we face. I focused there on overseas events, and particularly on the blowback of peoples throughout the world against imperialism, colonialism, and foreign intervention. Today, I want to deal primarily with what America has done in its attempt to create security for itself. I will avoid as much as possible assessing blame or giving credit, but rather will try to analyze actions in terms of their success or failure. To put our actions in perspective, I begin with what other nations have done that set the context in which we've operated and what we've learned, or particularly from Great Britain, that have so influenced our own strategies and tactics. Is there really anything we can think of as security? That is, within the general aims of our society, is security possible? Dwight Eisenhower doubted it. He said, if you want total security, go to prison. There you're fed, clothed, given medical care, and so on. The only thing lacking is freedom. I believe you'll agree with me that that degree of security is not affordable. Indeed, trying to achieve it has costs that sometimes make the medicine worse than the sickness. But security has been the prime objective of societies from the earliest times. Everywhere people built defensive barriers. Already in the little town of Jericho, about 7,000 BC, as we all learned in the beautiful Afro-American spiritual, the walls come a-tumbling down. But just the task of building them virtually destroyed the town. It has been calculated that about every adult male must have spent a quarter of his adult life laboring by hand to carry, quarry, and place as much rock and earth as would fill a large trailer truck today. Workers hardly had time to herd animals or raise crops. Even that huge expenditure of human muscle, walls didn't save Jericho. We know the inhabitants were killed, carried off, or ran away, and were replaced by invaders time after time, so their successors had to build or rebuild Jericho's walls at least 20 times. But almost everywhere and at all times, walls continued to be built. The Egyptian hieroglyph for town was wall, and the Chinese ideograph for city, Chang, rises from the character for wall. The Great Wall of China, the Ai, and its smaller cousin, Hadrian's Wall, were work of generations. Medieval Europe was made up of wall towns. The cost of building and manning its defenses literally bled the beautiful little city of Siena to death. We're all at it again in our time. The Maginot Line, the Italian barrier along the Libyan-Egyptian frontier, the French barrier they built during the Algerian War along the Algerian-Tunisian frontier, the Berlin Wall, the Israeli wall against the Palestinians, and today Mr. Trump is trying to copy them with the Mexican border. Common to all these efforts is that they were ruinously expensive and that they never worked. So the stronger, larger, and better organized societies often set about to destroy their enemies in their own homelands. From the time of the ancient Assyrians, the powerful carried war to weaker nations, much as the Americans did to the Red Indians, as I described in my first talk. The Boers did to the Bantu, the Chinese did to the Central Asian Zungarians, and no amount of military action brought more than a temporary security. More of the creation and the use of armies, like wall building, came at a ruinous cost. Whole societies were transformed, corrupted, or ruined by militarization. In medieval Italy, where warfare was endemic, a single campaign might cost a city-state 10 times its annual revenue. So it was that we owe to Florence two of the actions of government that control so much of our lives today. Florence created the first European tax, the catasso, and when that did not suffice, they carried out the first system of public debt, the Monte Comuni, or Mountain of Debt. Today we've enormously amplified both of these. Our wars cannot be paid for by taxation, and we will leave the bill to our grandchildren and perhaps even to their grandchildren. Even more detrimental than the monetary cost is the militarization of society. As I pointed out in my previous talk, our founding fathers knew that the pursuit of security through militarization transforms, subverts, or curtails essential liberties, and so weakens the civic institutions and practices it was proposed to suggest, to protect. Indeed, as Henry L. Stimson, in whose name we meet today, presently wrote back in 1932, unless some move is made to prevent war, modern civilization might be doomed. His answer was the Peace Convention, the Briand-Kellogg Pact for the Renunciation of War. It was signed by most independent nations, but it too did not work. It was not long before Germany and Italy bombed and destroyed Republican Spain. Italy conquered Ethiopia, and Japan pillaged and raped much of China. They brought the evils of war to virtually the whole world, including, of course, America. But hope springs eternal. Treaties are still being tried. Biological weapons were legally banned about a half a century ago, and chemical weapons were banned a few years later. But these horrible weapons continue to be manufactured, stored, and occasionally used. In July last year, 122 nations signed a treaty calling for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But of course, the ones that signed were the ones that didn't have weapons. The decision did not make war, but it accentuated what I call the apprehension of danger that shapes our lives today. Of course, apprehension of danger often itself leads to war. But even when it does not, it weakens the most precious and most fragile of our cultural attributes, our sense of civilized life. This is perhaps most evident in the use of torture and other inhuman activities that not only impact on the victims, but also pervert those that employ them. I would say, as an aside, one of the things that frightens me very much is to think that many of the people we've trained, for example, to carry out midnight raids in which people are killed in their beds without any immediate concern for them, bringing those people back to our society may turn out to be one of the most dangerous things we've ever done. So a few men have tried to dig deeper into the question of why we all, not just Americans, are a warring people. In his open letter of July 30, 1932, which is often referred to as the essay, Why War?, Albert Einstein asked, is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace of war, which has come to mean a matter of life and death for civilization as we knew it? Despite all the zeal displayed, he said, every attempt at solution has ended in lamentable breakdown. This must be, he concluded, because man has within himself such hatred and destruction. What can be done about this? Einstein decided the best person to address this question to was Sigmund Freud. But Freud offered Einstein neither solution nor solace. He believed that human nature was incorrigible. He thought that the only hope was to wrap mankind in what he called a Supreme Court of Judicature, with adequate executive force, because any effort to replace brute force by the force of an ideal, he said, under present conditions is doomed to fail. There is no likelihood of our being able to suppress humanity's aggressive tendencies. So what is the record of humanity's aggressive tendencies in our time? Forgive me for indulging in some detail. It does no good to recount the current litany of events. We're daily regaled with them. I'm also reacting, I have to say, against the attitude I encountered during my brief time in government service. Never ask what caused a given problem. Just deal with it and see what it can be done at that time. In Texas in my youth, people used to use the expression, ready, shoot, aim. I think it is important in trying to see what prevents us from feeling secure to know how Americans got involved with the issue of security and what we're trying to do to achieve it. There is no agreed place to begin discussion of the tumult of the last century, but it seems to me that the character and dimensions of the challenge we face right now are marked by strategic doctrines and tactical actions we can trace down and perhaps rather crudely summarize under the totem animals that we have in the world: the lion, the bear, and the eagle. The British lion had grabbed large chunks of the Mughal Empire and was feeding itself and financing what we call the Industrial Revolution from the rich Indian subcontinent. Without the Indian Empire, King George III feared that England would be, as he called it, a toothless little beast, living off of scraps. But with India, it became a lord of the world. So the lion roared and flailed away to acquire not only India, but also its neighborhood, and to keep everyone else out. The most important everyone else was the Russian bear. Starting with Ivan the Terrible, Russian czars plunged down the Don and Volga, and they too wanted a piece of India. Peter the Great got as far as the Caspian Sea, and his successors threw their armies into the Ottoman Empire in attempts to break out of the Black Sea into the warm Mediterranean. The epic and romanticized battles of the lion and the bear, the great game in the towering mountains of Afghanistan, and the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimea were the nursery rhymes, in effect, of Winston Churchill. All his life, Churchill was obsessed with blocking the Russian route to British India. To him, that meant keeping the Ottoman Empire alive and enabling it to hold to the choke point, as strategists call it, of the Turkish Straight. With a cork in the bottle opening at Istanbul, the Russians would be contained to the Black Sea. British strategy worked, but the Turks eventually overplayed their part. In the First World War, they closed the straits to both the Russians and the British and starved Russia into the 1917 revolution. War and revolution swept away the 19th century. In just a few years, both the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire collapsed, and British India began the political evolution that would lead a quarter of a century later to its independence. The world changed, but Churchill, ever the imperialist, kept to his strategy. If India would no longer be the British Empire, though Churchill certainly tried his best to prevent the coming of independence, the neighborhood became a vital British interest. India's contribution to the empire was taken up by the oil fields of the Middle East, particularly in Iran. Without Middle Eastern oil, got cheap on concessionary terms of imperialism, Churchill feared that England would starve. So the overriding goal was to find a new checkpoint to keep out the Russians. Since Turkey was no longer available, he decided the best barrier was Greece. He determined that Greece would be Britain's notional wall. Churchill's strategy was a holdover of the 19th century. Then the powerful countries treated the weaker countries like lifeless pieces to be moved around on the playing board by the great powers. Churchill and many others followed the South African leader, General Jan Smuts, in thinking of little countries as dominoes. Neither in Greece nor elsewhere did Churchill see that in the struggling for freedom, societies had become nations with their own aspirations. To Churchill, Greece was still just a domino. He had little interest in and virtually no knowledge of what was happening in Greece. What was happening was that the German invasion had driven out the Greek king, his immediate entourage, and his army. They all ended up in British-controlled Egypt, under British control. But the king left behind the bureaucracy and the security forces of the former dictator, Yanis Metaxas, who, under the king, had been the effective ruler of Greece. Metaxas had tried to turn Greece into a Nazi state, complete with the Greek versions of the Gestapo, the SS, and even Hitler Youth. Metaxas had died, but the regime he established lived on and collaborated with the Germans. Indeed, if the Germans and the Italians had been wise enough not to invade Greece, Metaxas probably would have led his state into the Axis itself. But like most invaders, the Germans were not wise. They made the vast majority of the Greeks their enemies. Seizing Greek industry and draining the country of food, they starved the population. Finally, desperate and angry, the Greeks developed a vigorous political anti-Nazi resistance movement. Perhaps even more than Tito's partisan movement, the Greek National Liberation Front, the EAM, grew into a national movement. The British Secret Intelligence Service thought it enrolled virtually the entire adult population and estimated its military forces at about 50,000 guerrilla fighters. By comparison, the underground in France, about which all of us have heard much more, with a population 6 times as large, probably never numbered more than 1/10 as many, and unlike the French underground, the EAM controlled virtually the entire country. Like most the Asian liberation movements, it was inspired by and partly led by the communists. The EAM was determined to come out of the war heading for a new way of life. That movement terrified Churchill. He agreed with South Africa's General Smuts that Greece was the first domino to fall in what he called a wave of disorder and wholesale communism that was sweeping over Europe. Greek nationalists, he decided, were just communists under a different name. Not only would they not block a Soviet move south, but they would help the Soviets to stabilize both the oil states of the Middle East and the Western European states. To block the expected Russian move in the south was, he believed, the imperative of strategy. So Churchill, with his eye fixed firmly on imperial strategy, took an initiative that shaped much of the world in which we've lived during my lifetime. But it still is not fully appreciated, so let me recount just a bit of it. The surest way to regime change, the EAM, Churchill believed was military force. And the major military force was the one General Eisenhower was readying for an attack on German-dominated Europe. Churchill tried very hard to get the Allied war planners to direct it from Italy to Greece, but Eisenhower refused. Rebuffed, he decided on another strategy. Since he thought that the Greek EAM was simply a communist organization, he concluded it must be under the control of Stalin. So if Eisenhower wouldn't play ball, the game had to be played with Stalin. In May 1944, Churchill sent Foreign Minister Anthony Eden to Moscow to propose a deal. When the Russians seemed receptive, Churchill himself flew to Moscow in October. And sitting across the table from Stalin in the Kremlin, he scribbled a short note, which he passed over. That note is today in the Public Record Office in England. In the note, he proposed a swap. Britain would recognize Soviet control over virtually all of Eastern Europe if the Soviet Union would recognize British control over Greece. Churchill snapped up the offer. So it was from Churchill's deal that the Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe may be dated, and it happened almost a year before the Yalta Conference, for which Roosevelt was excoriated for having been soft on communism and having been outsmarted by Stalin. It was the great Cold Warrior, Churchill himself, who planted the cornerstone of the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was then hammered into place by the Soviet Army's destruction of the German army. Profiting from the collapse of the German occupation of Greece, the British were then able to invade Greece, divide and weaken the underground, and reimpose the monarchy. Keeping his part of the bargain, Stalin told the EAM leaders that they'd better make a deal with the British. The Russians would not help them. The EAM tried to fight on, and defeating them proved to be expensive. As Britain was nearly broke, it was no longer able to afford Churchill's strategy. So with a remarkable sense of resilience and shrewdness, Churchill turned to the American eagle. Knowing these events helped us to understand both the European Cold War and the American intervention in Africa and Asia. Of course, America had no Indian empire to protect and felt secure in holding on to its share of Middle Eastern oil, which was mostly in what was essentially then American-dominated Saudi Arabia. To win its cooperation, Britain had to sound a different message. That message was at hand. It was a combination of fear of communism and the idea that nations were like dominoes. In essence, that was the message that Churchill took to a still very unsophisticated Harry Truman. American leaders had feared communism for decades, and so convincing them of the danger was easy, and the domino image was visually dramatic. It seemed both to explain the war-shattered European states and the former colonial areas and to point toward ways to secure them. Above all, it had the great virtue of simplicity. Suddenly, dominoes became everyone's favorite game. It was eagerly played or eagerly attended by all of Truman's closest advisors and would become the image of American policy and organization for decades to come. Even later, when he became president, Ronald Reagan proclaimed, and I quote him, that if the Russians weren't engaged in this game of dominoes, there wouldn't be any hotspots in the world. So how to apply the domino image? Fear that the war weakened Italy and France would fall under communist control was the challenge in Europe, while the assumption of the British role in Greece set the pattern for the Truman Doctrine and the extension of the American role in the Middle East and South Asia. Meanwhile, in the Far East, Japan had surrendered. The American government believed that more or less single-handedly it had won the Pacific War, and therefore was entitled to dictate the peace. It signed a peace treaty with Japan on its terms, including, to the anger of the Russians, the preservation of the role of the emperor on an American battleship and under an American flag, without any Soviet participation, and established its own administration, both in Japan and that part of Korea it controlled. Further, it massively, but ultimately and effectively, supported the anti-communist Chinese ally, Chiang Kai-shek, and aided France also massively, but equally and effectively, in its attempt to recapture its Indo-European colony. Taking a page out of the British playbook for Greece, it set about suppressing the left-wing, America set about suppressing the left-wing nationalist movement, its wartime ally, the Philippine underground that seemed to Americans a sort of oriental version of the EAM. Most powerfully, it also carried out the coup d'etat that overthrew the democratic elected government of Iran. Lurking behind all these diverse and little understood movements was assumed to be local communists and Soviet imperialism. Truman and his advisors, with much encouragement, thought that they had to move massively into the chaos and confusion of the post-war and post-colonial worlds. If they did not, they believed, country after country would tumble like dominoes and America would find itself alone. To cope with this new world, President Truman concluded America would have to reorganize itself. Part of the model for the revamped government already existed. The tasks of mobilizing, deploying, and sustaining a huge military force, as it had to do during World War II, gathering the necessary raw materials, organizing the industry to fabricate weapons, had forced the creation of a vast new bureaucracy. Recondite skills had to be improved or acquired. The American code-breaking effort, for example, in intelligence, was already well advanced, and the extra parts that had to be acquired could be acquired from the British. Spying, as was politely called human intelligence, was avidly studied at the feet of the British Secret Intelligence Service by the OSS. Enough remained of the pre-war Army and Navy to command structure that it was able to carry the weight of this vast new expansion. But Truman and his advisors thought that the early activities had to be regularized and expanded. Thus, in July 1947, at his urging, Congress passed the National Security Act. The National Security Act created both the National Security Council, the NSC, and the successor to the Wartime Intelligence Organization, the CIA. The NSC would preempt some of the traditional functions of the cabinet. Under the chairmanship of the president, it was shaped to favor a military view of American overseas challenges. As originally organized, it included the civilian secretaries of Defense, Army and Navy, and Air Force. But 2 years later, the civilian secretaries were dropped and were replaced by the general, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As it evolved under President Eisenhower, the NSC became a sort of executive government within the traditional civil government. These were the first steps in what came to be called the national security state. Parallel to the NSC, and in some ways to the CIA, was another new organization, the Policy Planning Staff. When General George Marshall became Secretary of State in 1947, he was appalled to find that the civilian side of the government had no general staff. So he created the Policy Planning Staff to lay out a master plan on how to deal with the world at large, and particularly with the Soviet Union. It was this task that brought to the fore two particularly remarkable men, George Kennan and Paul Nitze. Kennan and Nitze's views of the world and the task before the American government were different, but they were different only in degree. Both were hawks, in the current phrase, and both focused on the Soviet Union. But Kennan believed that time was on the side of America and that the Soviet Union would evolve peacefully, whereas Nitze thought the West had no time, and he advocated swift action against an implacable and evil enemy. As Kennan summed up his position, and I quote, "The Soviet leadership had no preconceived design for world conquest. Its psychology was primarily defensive." But he also believed the Soviet Union must face an impenetrable barrier. That barrier had to be a reconstructed Europe anchored in Germany. And this he underwrote in the great program he initiated, the Marshall Plan, that embodied the concept of containment. Kennan was no dove. Indeed, at that time, there were practically no doves roosting in the White House or the State Department, and certainly none in the Defense Department. Kennan not only favored the use of power, but he advocated using it in all of its forms, including espionage. However, he sought to rule out large-scale armed force, which would return the world, he thought, to general war, and so destroy its hopes for well-being, security, and peace. A wise strategy, he argued, was to give the USSR time to evolve toward peace and prosperity, while at the same time showing its leaders that aggressive action did not work. Behind his analysis, there were some hard facts. Russia had been severely weakened by the German invasion and had not recovered. In 1947, the U.S. produced 4 times the amount of steel, 5 times the amount of aluminum, 6 times the amount of kilowatt hours of power, and 8 times the amount of oil as the Soviet Union. And the gap was widening in America's favor. Carefully played out, Kennan thought, containment would force the Soviet leaders to recognize that since the costs of war were so horrible and the advantages of America over the Soviet Union were so great, they would mellow. Time, he argued, was on the American side. That was not the conclusion of Paul Nitze. Nitze was Kennan's successor as director of the Policy Planning Staff, and he set out his argument in what was perhaps the single most influential government policy paper ever confirmed. We know it as NSC 68. NSC 68, which was commissioned by President Truman on January 1, 1950, called for a massive buildup of both conventional and nuclear arms. In it, Nitze deprecated Kennan's idea of containment, as he wrote, "Without superior aggregate military force in being and readily mobilizable, a policy of containment, which is in effect a policy of calculated and gradual coercion, is no more than a policy of bluff." As McGeorge Bundy commented when he delivered the Henry Stimson Lectures here 15 years ago, NSC 68 took the gloomiest possible view of containment. Indeed, Nitze's plan called for America to prepare for war. Security would be achieved by overwhelming military force. Nitze's and Kennan's contrasting positions were never seriously debated, because on June 25, 1950, North Korean military forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. And as Secretary of State Dean Acheson commented, Korea preempted discussions on American strategy. The North Korean action was taken as confirmation of Nitze's argument. it would become American policy. More immediately, the hard-fought, nearly lost, and nearly nuclear Korean War contributed to a climate of fear and mutual distrust, so evident in foreign affairs, and in the decline of mutual respect and civility within American political circles. These are forces with which we continue to struggle today. Then, as Nitze's position began to be known, many of the scientists who worked on the atomic bomb were horrified as they saw Nitze's nuclear weapons policy implemented by what came to be called the military-industrial complex. Einstein spoke for many of them when he said, "If I had known they were going to do this, I would have become a shoemaker." He and a number of other leading scientists formed an organization to try to slow down or even to give up nuclear weapons. But Nitze had set out a worldview and a plan that both Democrats and Republicans found not only attractive, but necessary. Ironically, NSC, however, provoked a massive Soviet nuclear weapons buildup itself, and so it was in effect self-defeating, as well as self-confirming. The Soviet Union was and had to be building up a potential for war. 30 years of difficult and dangerous negotiations or relations followed, and during them Europe recovered, but had become what came to be called the Cold War, nearly exploded into nuclear war on various occasions. Then the objective that both Kennan and Nitze had sought came to fruition, but not because of the action either one of them had advocated. What happened were two developments that neither Kennan nor Nitze could have predicted. The first was that the Soviet Union wrecked itself on a decade-long campaign in the 1980s in the Afghan mountains, just as America had bogged itself down in the 1960s in the Vietnamese jungles. The second transformation was that when he became the Soviet leader in the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev undertook a program of divestiture of central control and granting of virtual autonomy to the Soviet republics. In this process, the structure of the Soviet Union gave way. In the current phrase, the Soviet Union imploded. Both Kennan and Nitze focused their attention on the Soviet challenges in Europe. We can follow fairly closely how they shaped the Cold War, but there was no comparable strategist on what the French scholar Alfred Sonny dubbed Le Tiers-Monde, the Third World, the countries of Africa and Asia. What came to be called the Truman Doctrine was an echo of the British 19th century policy aimed at protecting India. What the British called the Forward Policy sought to block Russian moves southward by creating a notional wall of colonies or subservient regimes from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, starting in Egypt, whose Suez Canal formed another sort of choke point like the Turkish Straits. The British dominated the Persian Gulf, occupied Iran, invaded Afghanistan, set up outposts in Central Asia, organized a covert military assistance program for China, neutralized Tibet, and conquered Burma before reaching the anchorage of Singapore. The essence of that policy, the notional wall, was picked up a century later by John Foster Dulles when he became Secretary of State. He elaborated it by extensions of the European wall of NATO into the Asian walls of CENTO, or the Baghdad Pact, for the Middle East, and SIETO for the Southeast Asian countries. This was the essence of American Third World strategy in the 1950s. The question posed by Kennan, Nitze, and Dulles was how to implement these strategic notions. The essential questions were who would authorize them, who would pay for them, and who would implement them. The inescapable conundrum is who makes the decisions, the President and his staff, Congress, or the American people. As I've shown in my second talk, it was this essential question that was argued by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and ruled upon by the Supreme Court in 1936. It was approached by different angles by American thinkers during the Second World War. Kennan and Nitze agreed with each other and with Alexander Hamilton that the people were not qualified to make decisions on vital issues of war and peace. But Madison and the delegates of the Constitutional Convention insisted that, ignorant or not, the people had to be involved. American thinkers, statesmen, and educators have been struggling to bridge this dilemma ever since. The dilemma was succinctly put by my favorite American humorist, Will Rogers. He lampooned us when he said, "The problem ain't what the people know, it's what the people know that just ain't so." The public lack of knowledge was staggering. The bitter commentator on America, Ambrose Bierce, adapted the English poet John Keats's line, "They stood aloof in giant ignorance," to describe the American public. 1 in 4 Americans did not know the earth circles the sun, and despite Mark Twain's joke that God created war so that Americans would learn geography, we're told that 88% of young Americans couldn't find Afghanistan on a map. 75% couldn't locate Iran or Israel. 63% couldn't find Iraq. More than 7 in 10 didn't know what the U.S. government said was the reason for the Cold War. It didn't get any better among the elite. Among the financially most successful private citizens, wealthy donors to successful presidential candidates who were being nominated to represent the United States abroad, few had even a vague notion of the country to which they were being assigned. Sometimes they didn't even know where the country was. I intended to speak of the attempts to upgrade the knowledge of the public through education, but because of the time constraints, I've had to drop that part of my analysis. I've written about it elsewhere. I also, as a teacher, have to admit that while the effort has been impressive, it has not resulted in a sophisticated America. As Gouverneur Morris of New York, a delegate to the 1787 Congressional Conference, remarked, "One objective of the Constitution was to save the people from their most dangerous enemy, themselves." The Founding Fathers were deeply concerned about the manipulation of the fickle and ignorant public by tyrants, and they sought to guard the Republic structurally and defensively. They were not willing to adopt Hamilton's reshaping of America into an aristocracy, but thought they could accomplish the same aim by dividing the decision-making process and by centering the decision to go to war in the branch of government most immediately responsive to the public, the Congress. But in the early days, the Congress was just the public, with all of its faults and shortcomings. The faults and shortcomings are glaringly evident today. Congress makes little attempt to embody the national interest, but is itself essentially up for sale or rent as the members assemble the money they think they need to be reelected. Few of us who served in government have much respect for either its wisdom or its integrity. What the Founding Fathers sought was overturned in the centralization of war, making powers in the hands of the president, as we've seen, as a consequence of the Cold War, and is shaped by other parts of the world by the extension of the Truman Doctrine. As spelled out in NSC 68 and subsequent acts, the president can, on his own authority, launch wars, and even a worldwide general war, with or without provocation. In turn, or in sum, our lives are completely and utterly in his hands. This is true even if he happens to be suffering from a headache, has slept badly, is exhausted, has a temper tantrum, or is even drunk. As I have learned personally during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the heat of such crisis, when one is exhausted, one's judgment is always fragile. And if one is also suffering from numerous other problems, the fragility becomes a mortal threat to all of us. As the Defense Secretary Robert McNamara has written, I quote him, "The whole situation seems so bizarre as to be beyond belief. On any given day, as we go about our business, the President is prepared to make a decision within 20 minutes that could launch the most devastating weapons of the world. That is what we've lived with for 40 years, and with few changes, this system remains largely intact. We have so far been lucky, but lucky is not a stable base for policy. We cannot always count on having leaders of good sense and goodwill, nor, of course, can we count on others also having them. As our wise old philosopher Ben Franklin commented at the Constitutional Convention, he trusted the first president, George Washington, but he was not sure he would be able to trust any of his successors. As yet, it has come into focus in our times, Washington's successors have the sole control of the life or death of all of us. I turn now to what could provoke the operation of presidential power and the flow of ambiguous, often provocative and dangerous events. Long before the phrase was spoken, the Soviet Union was considered the evil empire. What we saw in our magic mirror, as I spelled out in my first talk, was that we were decent, honorable, and peace-loving. As John Winthrop had told us, we were doing what we did standing on the top of our hill for the benefit of the world. Virtually everyone in the U.S. government assumed the worst of the Soviet Union. So finding out what the Russians were doing was already in 1946 so urgent as to create what was called in government circles a need to know. Already in 1946, the Air Force had begun monitoring the borders of the Soviet Union and its satellites. As implicit American-Soviet gentlemen's agreement came into force, both sides were fairly restricted in the way they approached this task. Soviet planes flew along the Atlantic coast of America, and American planes flew along the frontiers of the Soviet Union. And at first, neither side tried to shoot down the other or to invade its territory. Then in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first nuclear device. In November 1950, Chinese forces entered Korea, and on December 16, 1950, President Truman declared a state of national emergency. Suddenly, gathering intelligence on the Soviet Union's capabilities, particularly on the presumed ability of the Soviet Air Force to attack America across Alaska and Canada, became insistent. Truman immediately approved aerial penetrations of Siberia. The U.S. had just acquired a new, relatively fast, high-flying bomber, the B-47, that could be modified for the task. The pilots of the B-47 took the first step in what became a lengthy game in which American and Russian fighter planes intercepted, followed, photographed, etc., but did not normally try to shoot down the other side's aircraft. However, surveillance soon turned into provocation. In the spring of 1956, President Eisenhower authorized a major aerial invasion of the Soviet Union. Armed B-47 bombers took off from an American air base in Thule, Greenland, and overthrew virtually the whole stretch of the Soviet Arctic. As James Banford has written, I quote him, over 7 weeks, almost daily, between 8 and 10 bombers launched, refueled over the North Pole and continued south over the Russian border. In one incursion, 6 armed aircraft flying abreast flaunted American power in broad daylight as though on a nuclear bombing run. Had they not been caught unprepared, the Russians might well have launched a counterattack with devastating results. The Soviet military came to regard penetrations of its airspace as intolerable. It was, after all, an affront to their professionalism. The first armed clash came apparently in 1949, and in the following 11 years, a dozen or more U.S. aircraft were shot down or crashed in or near the Soviet Union. Neither side admitted their existence. Finally, the CIA ordered a new aircraft, the Lockheed jet-powered glider, the U-2, and had it flown by CIA pilots. It was the CIA contract pilot, Gary Powers, who flew the U-2 that was brought down over the USSR in May 1960. The shooting down of the U-2 was perhaps the most publicized event of the Cold War. I have to interject here a small personal anecdote. Some years later, I was invited to lecture at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and I was being met at the airport by my old friend, Yevgeny Primakov, who later became the Soviet Prime Minister and was then a fellow of the institute of which I was president. And when he met me at the airport, he said, "Congratulations, I had no visa to go to Russia. Congratulations, you are the first American to come to Russia without a visa since Gary Powers." Fortunately, the advances in rocket technology have now largely rendered obsolete which could have been a trigger for war. But of course, many others resulted from the very advance of technology. There are now many more pieces of highly dangerous hardware placed in exposed regions or being used as props in signaling what strategists say is intent or warning. Thus, almost as dangerous as provocations were accidents and mistakes. As we all know from our daily lives, when almost anything, even paper clips, run into the thousands, some are almost certain to get lost, dropped, or broken. So it's been with nuclear weapons. Despite great and expensive efforts at command and control, there have been a number of near catastrophes, and presumably the Russians have had similar experiences. It's believed that about 50 bombs have been lost at sea, along with 26 nuclear reactors from 1950 to 1980. What happened after that date is so far unrecorded, but it probably as many as 1,000 significant nuclear bomb accidents, any one of which could have just wiped out a large city, have occurred. Former Secretary of Defense William Perry reported one that shows how minor could be the start of the nuclear war. The watch officer at the Strategic Air Command called him up in the middle of the night one time when he was Deputy Secretary of Defense to report that 200 ICBMs had been picked up on radar heading for America from Russia. Fortunately, the general quickly found out that the wrong tape had been inserted in the computer. It was a near miss. A response by American aircraft could have been a real-life enactment of the movie Dr. Strangelove. Sometimes even more dangerous than deliberate provocation was accident, or accident was routine. During the week of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the American Air Force went ahead with a previously scheduled test of an ICBM. It was programmed, after all, and all the arrangements had been made. So despite the fact that we were hovering on the brink of a war, those in charge simply went ahead. While I had access to all the actions during that week, I did not find out about the missile test until later. Remarkably, the Soviet intelligence and surveillance services didn't seem to find it either. Had they done so, they presumably would have regarded it as directed against their forces in Cuba, with also possibly the beginning of a world war. One does not have to be a paranoid or a believer in conspiracy theories to question whether such near misses are accidental or deliberate. I had some reason to know that a number of our senior military and some senior civilian officials were pushing the president very hard toward war during the missile crisis. Had the Russians detected the firing of that particular missile and reacted, the president almost certainly would have been forced to adopt what the generals were trying to force him to do. Mr. Perry, who was closer to the military than I, reached the same conclusion. As he wrote, many wanted to rush us into war. One plan to rush us into war was called Operation Northwoods. It was a complex, violent, and indeed treasonous plan to provoke a war with Cuba by both real and simulated attacks on Americans, in which some would be murdered, and the public would be told they had been killed by order of Castro. Almost certainly the president would have been pushed into war had the plan been carried out. The plan was prepared by a secret military unit under the auspices of the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemonster. Lemonster also attempted to enlist his fellow generals, so the plan could have been the opening gun of a coup d'etat. In effect, the coup had really already begun, as the military command was making plans and creating situations which it would not reveal to its civilian superiors, including the Secretary of Defense. The Joint Chiefs of Staff prevented even the Secretary of Defense finding out about their activities, but rather foolishly, they revealed at least part of their plans to the think tank they'd set up, the RAND Corporation. And there, one of the political military theoreticians, Daniel Ellsberg, recoiled in horror from their plan. And in his book last year, The Doomsday Machine, he pointed out that if it had been implemented, the planned nuclear strikes would have wiped out every city and most towns of the Soviet Union and China, killing about half the world's population, devastating most of the rest of the world, and almost certainly would have caused a Soviet counterattack that even with the small remnant of the Soviet forces that had survived would have killed about half the American population. As Ellsberg learned, the Air Force Chief, General Curtis LeMay, tried to keep the authority and ability to order strikes on his own. I had reason to believe that Ellsberg's assessment of LeMay's desire to strike the Soviet Union was correct. During my time on the Policy Planning Council, I was sent to ask LeMay about the message he'd been leaking to his friends in the Congress that the Chinese development of nuclear weapons must be stopped and that the Air Force could do the job. The parallel to North Korea today, I'm sure, will strike all of you. In answer to my questions for detail on what he proposed to Kennedy's critics, LeMay laid out a plan for an attack that certainly would have precipitated World War III. He was planning to fly 70 bombers across China toward the Soviet Union to devastate the area out in Xinjiang province where the Chinese were making and testing their nuclear weapon development program. As you will have observed, I had to leave out many topics in the time we've spent together. I've concentrated on the larger sense of strategy than the flow of events that I've touched on here, but I've written about most of them elsewhere. The challenges in our society that were brought about by the growth of the military-industrial complex and the lamentable and dangerous decline in the standards of civil discussion of national affairs. Perhaps I can do no better than to leave you with the plea that as each of us reviews the doleful events that daily impinge on our thoughts, we go to the bottom line. Do we feel safer as a result of the policies we've implemented or not? If not, then what could we have learned? I'm impressed with two sequences of events. Time proved to work in the Cold War. We are further from war with the Soviet Union today than we once were. And once we got out of Vietnam, it was fascinating how dramatic and how rapid the process of healing was in that country and in our relations with it. But we've not applied these successes to other cases, and we've gone back, indeed, now to the failed policies of the 1950s in pushing NATO, for example, into the Russian security zone in the Ukraine, and in seeking to overwhelm with regime change local societies by force or by threat of force in the Third World, and sometimes by the assassination of leaders of other nations, as the Senate committee under Senator Frank Church was able to document. In one instance, President Nasser was under attack, and he told Senator George McGovern that there had been 25 serious attempts to assassinate him. McGovern came back and demanded that the CIA tell him what the facts from their point of view were. And they came back and said, of the 25 he mentioned, we were only responsible for 12. But we've not applied our successes and have not gone back to find out what caused our failures. Indeed, we are going back to the failed policies of the 1950s. We have reacted by horror at the action of those we call terrorists and who call themselves defenders. There is much savagery on both sides and the terrible events that arise from this clash. I'm not qualified to pass a moral judgment, but I'm trained to evaluate results. Our attempt to achieve security by military, paramilitary, subversion, murder, and other means have not worked, nor are they likely to do so. Worse, as the effects spread, the virtual certainty of blowback on our society, even in the very attempt to achieve greater society, will also grow. It is long past time for us to reconsider, I think, what we're doing now, how the world is changing, and what we need to change to go with it. The quest for security must not blind us. As our great teacher, as I quoted him earlier, Benjamin Franklin, warned, those who would give up the essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Thank you very much.
We have time, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Polk, will you be so kind as to take questions?
Yes, sir.
Would you field them since you can see them?
Yes, sir. Fine.
Question, please.
Yes, sir.
You said earlier in your lecture that it would be the most dangerous thing to bring people from countries we've committed atrocities against to our shores. You stress this as a danger. Does that mean that you do not think that immigration from countries like Afghanistan and Iraq would be in order?
I didn't catch the first part.
No, you see, it said our people who are taking them out then come back.
Our people?
Yes.
Mhm.
Oh, I thought he was...
No. What I specifically was concerned with is we've trained, for example, in the Navy SEAL organization, people who, as a matter of routine, are trained to kill people.
Right.
And we ran into the same thing in Vietnam. One of my colleagues in Washington was a very civilized, sophisticated, and able man by the name of Bob Comer. He and I were two of the three members of the Crisis Management Committee during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I had enormous respect for his decency, his intelligence, and everything else. Suddenly I found that when he went out to Vietnam, he helped to create and was in charge of a program called Phoenix. And the Phoenix program murdered something like 20,000 Vietnamese, many of whom were, in effect, in quotes, sold by their local enemies or people to whom they owed money, or who did not pay them protection money. So that this program involved a fairly large number of Americans in the act that's not very dissimilar to the mafia activities. And in effect, we were creating a cadre of people with an experience of violating our codes of decency and law and order. And those people then coming back into American society are, it seems to me, a very serious danger.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder what you think about some of the recent scholarship and push.
Can you speak up just a little?
Yeah, sure. So I wonder what you think about the recent scholarship and push toward basically empowering women, giving women worldwide more equity, more money even, as a means of achieving international security. Is that something that's compelling for you, or do you think it's just sort of a product of our times? And what do you think about the State Department sort of moving away from that, I would say, in the past couple of years, whereas several years prior we saw more money going towards equity for women internationally?
Let me see if I fully understand. Whether women would play a more beneficial role in peace-seeking than men?
Whether sort of empowering women or promoting equity for women in the international context, do you adhere to this idea that it helps promote security itself?
I have been fortunate in my life to know a large number of women. Some of them were very nice, some of them were not nice. That's also true of men. I think the division of men versus women is a false one. I think we're talking about good people versus bad people, whether they're men or women. And for example, at Mrs. Mayer's request, I negotiated the peace treaty or the ceasefire between Egypt and Israel. Mrs. Mayer was a very, very tough woman. I don't think she was any lover of peace at all. The thing that she was involved with was a certain number of the Israeli citizens were being shot and bombed on the Suez Canal, and she wanted to stop that. On the other hand, Mrs. Merkel is, I think, a major force for peace in the world today. So I think it isn't, if you pardon my saying so, I think it's a sort of an American jump into a conclusion to say women versus men. I think it's like saying white people versus black people. I've known wonderful black people, and I've known a lot of awfully bad white people. But to make that distinction, I think, is a false one. I think empowerment of everybody, men or women, is a very significant goal that we all ought to move for. We need to have a world in which we, first of all, respect other people, and secondly, listen to them. And we don't really do either one of those today. And I think we paid a terrible price for that. And you had a second point.
Oh no, that was it. But just to clarify, since you've given me the opportunity, I so appreciate your comments, and I did not mean to suggest that there are any essential qualities to women that would make them peace-loving, so I appreciate your comments.
I think there is an issue about essential qualities in peace-loving for both men and women. We all have stomachs. And as long as we have a large part of the world population that goes hungry to bed every night, people don't have as much need or want or desire for peace as people who are relatively better off. That is an important thing, but I have found in my study of history that people are very often willing to give up even their jobs and even their homes, provided you don't attack their sense of dignity. And that is, in a sense, the persona issue is, it seems to me, so enormously important. We've recognized that in our approach to dealing with the Jewish population, the survivors of the Holocaust, where we've apologized. But we collectively in the West have killed an awful lot of people in the world and have destroyed a great deal of other cultures and other societies. And it seems to me that one of the things that a radical solution, or not solution, but a radical contribution toward a solution about the world would be to assuage the sense of outrage that people have. The Army, for example, conducted a study in Afghanistan not very long ago, in which they found that the level of violence was inversely proportional to the activities of the American military command. The stronger the actions of the Americans against, in quotes, terrorists were, the more violent activity that particular area experienced. To the degree that we can find ways that where we don't affront people in the world, even if we don't feed them, it seems to me it would be a major step forward. But of course, we need to also think about the disparity of income, the disparity of hope that people have. When I was young, I spent a fair amount of time in both Africa and Asia, and I found that one of the remarkable things was that when you came across people who had that sense of cohesion and integrity, or cohesion and self-respect, they were perfectly willing to give up, particularly to entertain a foreign guest, what was enormously expensive to them. You think of a poor Bedouin in the desert who is willing to slaughter virtually his last sheep in order to entertain a guest would be comparable in comparable terms like my being willing to give a guest my house. And that was virtually his life. But the integrity, the sense of decency, the sense of honor was more strong even than the material issue. And to the degree that we can change our attitude toward the sense of seriousness and decency and honesty of other people, that's a real move toward peace, whether it's men or women, is to me irrelevant. Yes, sir.
Drawing on your comments about nuclear weapons, one of the kind of hallmarks of credible nuclear strategy dating back, of course, many decades, is the ability of the executive to essentially kind of quickly launch based on a flexible set of options, like the ones that Stratcom has set out for the U.S. president. And I'm wondering, kind of based on your comments, what you think in the post-Cold War era about strengthening checks on presidential launch authority of nuclear weapons, and what that might mean for the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence and just U.S. deterrence in general, while the United States faces potential adversaries who most certainly would not do the same thing.
I think your question is a very important one. Did all of you hear that too?
Yeah.
I'm partially deaf, so I'm sensitive to whether people hear anything or not. I think that a part of the problem lies beyond your question. Part of the problem is that events leading up to that question have to be stopped at an earlier stage. An analogy that I've came to in my government service was, if you think of policies or actions of any one of us, but particularly a government, like an alphabet, you take step A, then you take step B, and you take step C. It's almost inevitable that you take step D, because it's the logical consequence. When you've taken steps A, B, and C, to then try to change and go over to a different alphabet is very hard to do and doesn't usually work. But the problem that you raise is a very difficult one. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where I happen to have sort of cut my teeth on this question, the president was certainly prepared to react. But in the Constitution, the president is not supposed to react proactively. He's not supposed to carry out a first strike. And what really frightened the Russians in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and almost led to the war, and certainly led to the crisis itself, was the fact that we were stationing nuclear weapons in Izmir that were first strike weapons. They were liquid-fired weapons. The Russians weren't worried about the bombers we had in central Anatolia. They were very worried about the missiles. And they countered that with their missiles in Cuba, and the swap was to get rid of both of them. The swap was a very intelligent thing, but it was extremely hard for President Kennedy to do, because he was in quotes, a liberal who was elected on a very thin margin of votes, and he felt very delicate about that, and the military was pushing him very hard to engage in war. And war is a curious thing too, in terms of judging from what you commented. By the Thursday of the missile crisis, all of us were so exhausted that I don't think anybody, certainly not I, had any sense that we were really thoroughly in control of our emotions. And at a certain point, the feeling was, let's just get it all over with. And I think that's a very dangerous situation. So to the degree possible, one needs to, A, avoid the issue insofar as you can possibly do it before the question you raise comes up. And B, if you've not been able to do it, then it seems to me that you still, the best hope you have is to not have that immediate reaction. If you have a virtually automatic reaction, as we all saw in Dr. Strangelove, for example, then all hope is gone. And in fact, much of the technology that we've developed about the control of nuclear weapons depends on virtual automatic reaction. So this is a very delicate and complicated question, but within a general perspective, I would be in favor of preventing the president from having that kind of control. And as we've seen, and as Benjamin Franklin warned us about what we're likely to face in American politics, we have to reckon that we won't always have a president who is extremely stable and extremely able to control the forces of his own mind, much less the society. Sir.
Yeah, could I just follow up on that a little? Sorry, my voice is not what it should be. By coming back to something I mentioned the other evening, but not in front of the group, and this is following up. My understanding is that in the last year of the Nixon administration, when he had become quite paranoid and was getting drunk a lot and giving bizarre orders at night.
This is Nixon.
Nixon, yeah. That a set of protocols was developed whereby he was told, yes, this will be done, Mr. President can go back to bed and so forth, and that it was actually even formalized into, or semi-informalized, into an agreement among the Joint Chiefs that if ordered to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union, they wouldn't do it unless all 5 of them agreed, even though this was in violation of the chain of command. And I think that, maybe it's too Pollyannish of me, I suspect that there's some sort of informal agreements around Trump as well. And so to my mind, this is my question, isn't the real danger not that that we would inadvertently or through some executive overreach start World War III with the Russians or with the Chinese? Isn't the danger much more the kind of war that the military would mind having much less, like Iran, let's say, ramping up the conflict with Iran? And so it's not these Armageddon type scenarios we really have to fear, because after all, these generals, they themselves have families and children and grandchildren, and they don't want to blow up the world necessarily. But it does seem to me that the real threat is much more these kind of medium-sized powers, or Iran is the most obvious one right now. But how would you react to that?
I'm scared to death of both of them. But I think you're right. There would be more likelihood of the military going along with the idea of attacking Iran, for example, and that's what they did in Iraq. But Nixon was a very strange man in many, many ways. I was asked by Henry Kissinger to join his government, and I said to Kissinger, who was then working for Rockefeller, that if Rockefeller were elected, I would be willing to talk about the job they offered me. But with Nixon, I certainly wouldn't. And I think probably the military felt a little bit that way too. But the whole theory of deterrence rests on the idea that it would be absolutely automatic, that regardless of anything else, the military had to go along with this, and that the Soviet Union had to know that the military would not be able to stop it. So I think the issue is to some extent academic, that whether indeed it would happen one way or the other, none of us can really predict. Yes, sir.
Looking at what the UN Security Council has done in the last couple of years, what is your opinion? Is that body still capable of giving us some affordable security?
Wow. Are there any easy questions in this group? I think we know all of us are terribly failed, and all our capacity, terribly flawed in our capacity to deal with any of these questions. There was never an intent that I know of that anybody thought that the UN would be really an executive organization. And we in the American government treated it with utter contempt, unless we wanted to use it for some reason. And the idea that a group of people sitting in the Security Council could really perform the tasks that we would like them to perform is very slight. And they have no capacity, of course, to allocate military force or to do other things. And in fact, from the Russian point of view, the Security Council has been essentially an American operation. And the whole UN has been an American operation. But my hunch is that you have a better chance with an ecumenical group of people, that is a group of people from various different countries. That was, as I pointed out in one of my earlier talks, that was the intent behind the American emphasis on using the Congress rather than the president to make these basic decisions, because the Congress was presumed to be close to the people, and the Security Council could be presumed to be closer to world opinion than the opinion of any one government. But I think the actual implementation of that has left a very great deal to be desired.
If there's no more questions, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, is there one?
Yeah.
Please. Okay, let
This will be the last one.
Polk, let this be the last question, the last difficult question.
All right. I'd just like you to go on a little bit from where you finished. You said that you have, looked at sort of the measure of success of American attempts to achieve security. And I wondered what that report card sort of looked like in multiple domains. We've talked a lot about, the continued risk of nuclear holocaust. But there have been other arguments, for example, Pinker's book, right, that this is the safest and best time to be around in the world ever. That your average American is further from violence than at any point in history. That despite 20 years of forever war, most people experience it not at all. And I wonder if maybe there are domains in which the United States has been successful as well as unsuccessful in achieving security.
I think that's a very, very important point, a very important issue to determine. My own personal experience has been that, as I think I mentioned earlier on, that when I was a young man and I traveled around quite supposedly disturbed areas, I felt perfectly safe. Today I don't. I couldn't go into most of those areas. I was in Afghanistan again for the umpteenth time 2 years ago, and I stayed with the American ambassador. And I was checked in 5 times through various groups of mercenaries that were hired to protect the ambassador and the embassy, and could not move outside the embassy at all. Whereas in 1962, I took a 2,000-mile trip around Afghanistan and went to every village and talked to everyone I could possibly talk to. I was in Libya with similar experiences, in Somalia, on and on and on. I feel relatively safe, I must say, here, but 2 things worry me about the future that make it difficult to produce your report card right now. We haven't had the final exam. One of these is, as I mentioned, people coming back into American society from extremely violent experience and long-term violent experience, not just one time, but a lot of times. And if you look at the statistics of the Veterans Administration hospitals, you find the post-traumatic experience impact has been enormously powerful on a very large number of people. Indeed, so many that I would doubt that many of them even had very much combat experience. but the ones with severe combat experience, the statistics on spousal abuse, on robbery, on violence, on murder, on nervous breakdown, on suicide, a whole range of things have been enormously powerful. And those are people who are now coming back into our society. They're uncles, cousins, husbands, and so forth of large numbers of people. What kind of an impact do they have on our sense of civility? I don't know.
I'll keep my hands where you can see.
The number of handguns in America, as we all know, the number of people who feel under the threat of violence, not violence, but under the threat of violence, has enormously increased. And I think that however one feels about the right or wrong of most of the issues we're talking about, if you talk to people who've lost a brother or lost a cousin or lost a child in a bombing raid, you find a great deal of understandable anger. And the more we use drones and other things and carry out midnight raids and kill people, it seems to me that we would have to be very naive to think that at some point these people are not going to react and blow back, as the expression is, into our way of life, our society. The horrible thing that we all have focused on for the last decade or so has been, of course, the attack on the World Trade Center. But there are a lot of things before the World Trade Center that make it don't justify it, but make it understandable. And the difference between justification and understanding is, I think, often blurred. That we need to understand a lot of things that we don't understand about what causes people to do things. So I feel quite pessimistic about the future in those terms. I think that the number of likely attacks on civilian targets is very much enhanced. And if I were policy planner for a violent group, I would say you're doing it just right. The trick is to make you feel unable to do certain things that you like to do. That was spelled out. I think I mentioned this in another context in another lecture. The real architect of the theory of counterinsurgency was a British officer by the name of Caldwell. He wrote a book called Small Wars. And his idea was that the way you have to beat down colonial people is to hit them where it really hurts them, the things they really count about. And this is, I don't know whether any of these leaders of the various insurgencies have read them, but this, it seems to me, is the essence of the smart policy for them. What they need to do is to cause us to do things like jujitsu, where we use our own strength against ourselves. And look at what the result was of the 9/11 attack in New York. For cost of maybe $100,000 and the lives of perhaps 15 or so of their willing agents, Osama bin Laden caused America to spend $2 or $3 billion, or maybe more, in all kinds of new measures, caused us to put surveillance units around the country, caused us to mobilize our militia forces, cost us tremendous amounts of money in various other ways, and keyed us into a position where we lost a lot of our freedom. And that was a pretty smart move. It was, I think you have to admit, perhaps the most successful military campaign ever carried out. For practically nothing, they won a very considerable victory. And I think that they're not stupid, whatever else you may think about them, and the smart thing to do is to do similar things. So I expect that no matter how much surveillance we use, how much control we have over surveillance of our bodies, of our cities and everything else, there will probably be other attacks. And the military campaign in Syria resulted in a loss of territory by the Islamic State, but the people who were not killed went home. And the Russians tell me that they're very much more worried about the people who went home than they are about the people who stayed and are trying to do things in the Middle East. And I think that what you will have to anticipate is the next generation will look back at those people as the heroes, the older generation that fought the good fight. And they will be the people who will set the tone, just as we believe the people who fought the British and the American Revolution were our heroes. And we have try to follow them as much as we can. That's not a very good analogy, I admit, but I think the essence is that we're at the beginning of a process, not at the end.
Professor Polk, for not just one, but 3 Stimson lectures, thank you very, very much indeed.